the era of Stevens Wharf. In 1776, the wharf belonged to the Stevens family. Robert Stevens was a man of immense influence, a merchant prince who provided the ropes, sails, and salt needed to keep Newport's massive fleet afloat. His grand mansion stood right at the corner of Thames Street, looking out over a forest of wooden masts. When the British occupied Newport during the Revolution, Stevens Wharf was a place of tension. It was no longer a hub of free trade but a landing point for redcoat soldiers and Hessian mercenaries. The Stevens family watched as their business withered under the British blockade, and by the time the war ended, the golden age of Newport's merchant kings was beginning to fade. The transition, Pilts and the distilleries. As the 1800s began, the waterfront was a patchwork of reconstruction. For a short time, the wharf was associated with George Pilts. This was an era of rum and smoke. Pilts operated a distillery on the property, turning molasses into the Newport rum that fueled the city's economy. During this period, if you asked a sailor where he was docking, he might have called it Pilts's, but the shadow of the Stevens family still hung over the deeds. The rise of George Bowen. The true transformation began in 1849. A shrewd and hard-working businessman named George Bowen looked at the aging wharf and saw something other than sails and rum. He saw the future: coal. The age of steam was arriving, and Newport needed fuel to heat its growing mansions and power its ferries. Piece by piece, between 1849 and 1863, George Bowen bought the property from the heirs of the Stevens family. He cleared away the remnants of the old colonial warehouses and established the George Bowen Coal Company. Huge coal pockets were built, and the sound of clanking machinery replaced the rhythmic chanting of sailors. The wharf became a place of soot and black diamonds, essential to the city's survival through the harsh New England winters. A legacy set in stone. By the time the Civil War ended, no one called it Stevens Wharf anymore. It was Bowen's Wharf, a name that became synonymous with the fuel that kept Newport warm. When the coal industry finally declined in the mid-20th century, the wharf faced a choice: decay or reinvent. In the 1960s, a group of locals decided to preserve the historic character of the coal wharf rather than tear it down. They kept the name Bowen's Wharf to honor the man who had anchored the waterfront during its industrial transition. Today, when you see the 1863 date on the signs at the wharf, you're looking at the year George Bowen finally completed his acquisition, forever etching his name into the history of Newport's harbor. The passing of the torch. By the late 1940s, the era of George Bowen's coal company was fading into a cloud of soot and memory. The massive coal pockets that once fed the city's furnaces stood like hollow wooden giants, and the black dust that had coated the cobblestones for nearly a century was finally being washed away by the salt spray. Newport was moving toward oil and electricity, and the wharf was at a crossroads. But where the coal barges left, the fishing boats returned. In the early 1950s, the heavy machinery was cleared away to make room for wooden crates and ice. The air at the wharf changed from the sulfurous scent of fuel to the sharp, fresh smell of the Atlantic. A new generation of Newport families, including the Fatulis, saw that while the city no longer needed coal to stay warm, it would always have an appetite for the treasures of the deep. The birth of the company. The Aquidneck Lobster Company was born from this shift. What was once a place of industrial grit became a cathedral of the sea. The old warehouses were refitted with massive saltwater tanks, and the sounds of clanking coal chutes were replaced by the rhythmic thrum of lobster boats, like the Santana and the Hobo, docking in the early morning mist. By the 1960s and 70s, Aquidneck Lobster wasn't just a local shop, it was the heart of the working waterfront. It became one of the largest wholesalers on the coast, a place where the floor was always wet, the boots were always rubber, and the lobsters were legendary. The Great Anchor of 1974. The most famous chapter in the company's history happened in 1974. A lobster boat was working the deep waters of the continental shelf, 150 miles out, when its gear snagged something massive. The crew struggled, thinking they had caught a boulder, but as they winched it to the surface, they saw the rusted, barnacle-encrusted fluke of an 18th-century anchor. They hauled the 3,000-pound relic back to Newport and landed it right at the Aquidneck Lobster docks. The wharf went wild. For weeks, the anchor sat among the lobster traps, a physical bridge between the modern fishing fleet and the colonial ships of Stevens Wharf. A living landmark. Today, the building at the end of the wharf still bears the name Aquidneck Lobster Company. Even as the rest of the wharf transformed into a world-class destination for boutiques and fine dining, the Lobster Company remained the anchor of the waterfront soul. When you walk past the tanks today, you aren't just looking at dinner, you're looking at a business that saved the wharf from becoming a relic. It kept the harbor alive, ensuring that even in the 21st century, the spirit of the Newport fisherman still has a place to call home. The stones of Newport have many names, whispered by the tide. They've seen the rise of merchant kings, and where the tall ships ride. A tapestry of salt and grit, where centuries collide. From Stevens' dock to Bowens' coal, with nothing left to hide. First was Stevens in the days of old, when tea and silk were weighed, before the drums of liberty, before the debts were paid. A wharf of hemp and heavy sail, where revolution stayed, until the smoke of British guns left all the dreams frayed. Then came Bowen, man of soot, who saw the future clear. He traded sails for blackened coal, to keep the winter near. For 100 years the iron clanged, and horses' hooves drew here, to haul the warmth of fossil fire, through many a changing year. But as the furnace fires dimmed, the ocean called once more. The aquidneck lobster rose to life, along the wooden shore. From coal to claws, from dust to deep, the ocean's silver store brought the rhythm of the fishing fleet through the open warehouse door. Today the wharf is polished bright, a jewel upon the bay, where children walk the cobblestones, where gulls and tourists play. The scent of salt and buttered rolls drifts through the summer day, while the ancient anchor guards the gate in its silent, rusted way. From Stevens' hope to Bowen's strength, to the harvest of the sea, the wharf remains a living heart of what it means to be a place that changes with the wind, but keeps its pedigree. The timeless soul of Newport's port, forever wild and free.